She was dying in the snow with her baby until a silent gunslinger gave them shelter in his cabin. "You're in too deep, Jessica. If you want that baby of yours to grow up breathing, you'll shut that pretty mouth of yours." Jessica stood frozen in the supply tent, her arms wrapped tightly around the bundle of blankets pressed to her chest. Her child stirred, letting out a faint whimper that was lost beneath the howling wind outside. Dawson's voice had never sounded colder, and it struck deeper than the wind ever could. The lantern swayed on its hook, casting shadows across Dawson's angular face. His eyes were sharp, unforgiving, the same eyes that had once looked at her with something that could pass for love. Now, they only burned with calculation. "I saw what you did," Jessica said, though her voice trembled. "You buried him. You let them kill him, then laughed while they took his boots." Dawson tilted his head slightly, amused. "And what do you think happens to little doves who sing in the dead of winter, sweetheart? They freeze, just like you will if you're not careful." Her grip tightened around her baby, whose breath warmed her chest through the fabric. "You said we were leaving this life. You said we were starting over." "I said a lot of things," he said coolly. "Plans change. Gold changes men." Tears stung Jessica's eyes, but she blinked them back. She had trusted him, believed the man who'd held her hand under the stars and promised her a better future. Now she saw the truth. He would kill to keep his gold, and he would kill her if it meant one less witness. He stepped closer. She didn't move. "If you breathe a word of this, if you even look at the wrong person the wrong way, neither you nor that kid will make it past the ridge." He gave a dry smile. "You'll just disappear into the snow, like you never existed." Then he walked out, his boots crunching on the frost outside. Jessica did not scream, she did not sob. She stood in silence as the lantern flickered lower, as her child shifted in sleep. Her heart thundered in her chest, but her body moved with terrifying calm. She packed a satchel, dried meat, a canteen, 2 thick blankets, a broken compass. She wrapped her son in a flannel shawl, pressed a kiss to his forehead, and stepped out into the storm. The night was sharp as knives. Wind cut across her cheeks and filled her ears with howls. The campfires behind her blurred into smoke as she stumbled forward, feet crunching across brittle crusts of snow. She did not stop. Her legs ached. Her lungs burned. The baby cried once, then settled, buried in the crook of her arm. She sang to him, not loudly, but enough for him to know she was still there. "Sleep, my baby, hush the snow, Mama's here, and we must go." It helped her focus, though her teeth chattered with each word. Hours passed. Trees became silhouettes. Her path twisted upward toward a ridgeline she barely remembered from summer rides. The sky was a slab of black, her vision blurred at the edges. One boot caught a root, and she collapsed hard. The baby whimpered. Jessica rolled over, pulling him close. Her hands were numb, her breath came in foggy bursts. Snow began to bury her legs. She whispered one last line, "You will live, even if I do not." Darkness pressed in, but then a sound. Footsteps. A shadow moved through the trees. It paused, then advanced. She barely saw him, just a tall figure in a heavy coat, rifle strapped to his back, a hat low over his face. He knelt silently beside her. His gloved hands checked the baby first, then lifted Jessica with practiced ease. He said nothing. Jessica tried to speak. Her lips cracked. No sound came. He hoisted both of them into his arms and turned back toward the trees. She remembered warmth, not immediate, but growing. The feel of fire, of wool, of something clean. She blinked against light, her eyelids heavy. When she woke again, she lay on a cot, covered in quilts. A fire snapped in the hearth. The baby slept nearby in a makeshift cradle lined with lamb's wool. Her boots were gone, her feet wrapped in dry linen. He was alive. He had saved her. And across the cabin, covered in dust and silence, stood an old upright piano, closed, untouched, as though waiting for a pair of hands that hadn't played in years. Jessica awoke slowly, not to voices or shouting, but to stillness. The kind of silence so complete it hummed in her ears. The fire was still alive in the hearth, casting a soft amber glow across the small wooden cabin. Somewhere nearby, her son stirred in his cradle, letting out a quiet grunt as he stretched beneath layers of wool. She sat up, her body protesting in stiff aches. Her boots had been removed, her feet wrapped tightly in dry cloth. The quilt over her shoulders smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. Her eyes scanned the room. The cabin was clean, organized, nothing wasted. Pots hung in order along one wall. A stack of chopped firewood stood perfectly aligned in the corner. A rifle rested against the window frame, oiled and ready. A kettle steamed quietly on the stove. And in the far corner, partially covered by a dark woolen blanket, stood something unexpected. A piano, upright, old, its surface dulled by dust but not decay. Its presence here, in the middle of a mountain forest, felt almost like a ghost. The door creaked. She turned sharply. A man stepped inside, arms full of firewood. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face hidden beneath a scarf and hat. His coat was thick, patched, worn at the sleeves. He said nothing as he crossed the room, placed the wood by the hearth, and poked at the fire until it cracked higher. She tensed, pulling the quilt tighter. He didn't look at her. Instead, he rose slowly, turned, and gave a single, small nod. Then he left again. She didn't hear his voice, not even his footsteps once the door closed. Jessica remained seated for some time, unsure if she had just dreamed him. But her son stirred again, mewling with hunger. She pressed him to her breast, exhaled a shaky breath, and leaned back against the wall. By midday she ventured from the bed. Her legs wobbled but held. She fed the baby the last of the jerky from her pack, boiled water for oats she found in a tin on the shelf, and changed his cloth using strips torn from her underskirt. Still, the man did not return. By dusk, the wind outside had risen again. Through the single window, snow fell thick and straight, muffling the forest like a white curtain. She gathered the baby in her arms, rocking gently near the fire. And then she sang, softly, uncertain at first. The same lullaby she had whispered in the snow, the melody thin, delicate, like the thread of her voice could snap at any moment. Sleep now, my darling, the snow's drifting down. Mama will hold you, no need for a frown. She felt her throat tighten, but she kept singing. Unnoticed, the cabin door opened. Jessica did not stop. The man, Charles, though she did not know his name yet, stood just outside the threshold, half shown by the doorframe. His coat dusted in snow, an axe still gripped in one hand. He did not step in. He did not speak. But as the lullaby filled the room, his body stilled. His hand, still clutching the axe handle, trembled slightly. So slight, it could have been the cold. Jessica saw it, from the corner of her eye. She saw the tremor, and something inside her paused. When the song ended, she looked up. He was gone. Only the fire answered her, crackling gently behind its stone mouth. But something had shifted. Not in the room. In him. The days passed slowly, marked by the rising of the fire and the soft cries of a baby finding his voice. Jessica regained her strength in small increments, first walking across the cabin, then gathering kindling near the porch, and finally cooking simple meals. Charles never asked her to do any of it. He came and went without words, always bringing something back, bundles of wood, herbs from beneath the snowline, fresh meat already cleaned and dried. He was as silent as the trees and just as steady. On the fourth night, Jessica sat near the hearth, her son asleep in her lap. The flames flickered over her face as she stared into them, her fingers trembling despite the warmth. "I saw him kill a man," she said quietly. Her voice did not tremble, though her eyes did not lift from the fire. It was over gold, always is. One of the younger boys, maybe 16, asked about his share. Dawson laughed and told the others to make an example. She swallowed hard. They dragged him behind the supply tent and slit his throat like it was nothing. And Dawson? He lit a cigarette and said, "That's the price of asking questions." Charles sat in the shadow near the door, sharpening a blade. He didn't look up. Jessica's voice cracked. And he told me, if I spoke to anyone, if I tried to run, he'd make sure my baby never saw sunlight again. Her hand brushed the baby's downy hair. He was the father. We were supposed to get married in spring. He even carved a cradle out of pine. Still, Charles said nothing. Jessica sighed. You're not much of a talker, are you? A few minutes passed in silence. Then she saw it. He stood up, moved toward the stove, and tossed something into the fire. The paper caught instantly, curling with heat. But not before she saw the headline. The image. The name. Charles McCade, notorious gunslinger, still at large, wanted dead or alive. Jessica froze. Her breath hitched. Her eyes shot to his face, but he didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge what he had done. He merely turned and went back to his seat, blade in hand, calm as ever. The silence between them thickened. She stood slowly, walked to the cradle, and pulled the baby closer. But her heart wasn't racing. Not like it had with Dawson. Not like it had when she'd hidden behind barrels, watching blood soak through snow. Charles had saved her, fed her, wrapped her son in warm wool. And when she sang, he had trembled, not with anger, but with memory. She looked back at him. I should be afraid of you, she whispered. Charles looked up. Their eyes met. She held his gaze for a long, long moment. But I'm not. That night she found a bowl of beef bone stew by the cradle, still warm. Beside it, folded neatly, was a gray woolen scarf, worn but clean. She didn't need a note to know who had left it. Jessica wrapped the scarf around her shoulders. The smell of pine and tobacco made her chest ache. She slept. But rest did not come easy. Somewhere in the early hours, she dreamed. Dawson appeared, covered in frost, his face twisted in fury. He tore the baby from her arms. She screamed, begged, lunged. Too slow. She heard the gunshot before she saw the blood. She bolted upright, gasping. The room spun. She couldn't breathe. Then a hand touched her forehead, cool, steady. She blinked. Charles stood beside the bed, his expression unreadable in the firelight. He reached into his coat, pulled out a pistol, and without a word, slid it beneath her pillow. Their eyes met again. She didn't ask why. He didn't explain. Then he turned and walked back into the dark. Days passed like whispers through snow. Charles moved like a shadow, rising before dawn to split logs, melt snow for water, and check traps along the lower ridge. He never spoke unless necessary, and even then his words came slow and gravel-thick, like each one had to crawl out of something buried deep. Jessica watched him from the window sometimes, her son nestled in her arms. There was something rhythmically mournful about the way he moved, methodical, practiced, but empty, like he was building a life he had no intention of living. Inside, she made the space warmer, not with heat, Charles already kept the fire fed, but with little things. She washed the curtains, rearranged the shelf, sang lullabies louder. The cabin didn't feel like a prison anymore. But it did feel like a tomb. One night, after dinner, she sat by the fireplace, rocking the baby gently. Did you ever think about playing again? She asked. Charles looked up from where he was oiling his rifle. Playing? He asked. She gestured toward the piano. His eyes followed. The firelight flickered across his face, casting half of it in gold, the other in darkness. He said nothing for a long time. Then slowly he held out his hands. Scarred, torn, burned, fingers that had curled around triggers and blades, not keys. I used to make a living playing, he said finally. Piano bars, church halls, one time a train station for a man who never made it home. He stared at his hands again. These fingers once made people cry, he added. Now all they do is bleed. Jessica didn't speak. She knew when silence was the truest comfort. That night, after Charles went out to check the traps, she stayed by the hearth. Her son was asleep beside her, his breath soft and steady. She took out her sewing kit, worn, frayed, barely holding together, and found a scrap of clean linen. She stitched quietly, her fingers moving with purpose. By the time Charles returned, shaking snow from his coat, the cloth was pinned above the fireplace. It was simple, Two names, in soft blue thread. Charles. Noah. He saw it. Stood still in the doorway, watching it flutter faintly in the warm air. She didn't explain, she didn't need to. No words passed between them. But for the first time since she had entered the cabin, she saw something in his eyes. Not grief, not guilt, just presence. As if he had been a ghost, and someone had called his name out loud for the first time in years. The morning broke cold and white, a world held in stillness beneath layers of snow. Charles left early to check the snares and return with firewood, as he always did, but something in the silence felt wrong. Near the stream, just beyond the ridge, he saw it. Hoofprints. A single set, but fresh. Deep in the snow. A large animal, a strong rider. The tracks did not belong to any of the game that roamed these parts. He followed them 20 paces, knelt beside a pine tree, and pressed his gloved hand into the print. Damp, less than a day old. Someone had been watching. By the time he returned to the cabin, the clouds were turning gray again, warning of another storm. Jessica was humming quietly as she rocked Noah near the fire, a soft tune winding through the warmth like thread. She looked up and saw the tightness in his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. "What is it?" He met her eyes. Rider. Close. Her blood turned to ice. She stood slowly, clutching Noah to her chest. "You think it's Dawson?" "I do not guess," Charles said, "but we act like it is." He moved with silent precision, transforming the peaceful cabin into a fortress. He dragged the bench to block the door, nailed old planks across the back window, and checked the hinges on every shutter. He laid out the weapons with methodical care. 2 rifles, a worn shotgun, and his own revolver, which he placed gently on the table like it was sacred. Jessica watched, swallowing hard. "What are you going to do?" "Prepare." He walked to a chest in the corner and pulled out a bundle wrapped in canvas. Inside was a smaller pistol. Simple, old but well kept. He checked the chamber, then held it out to her. He stared. "I've never touched one." "You will." He didn't raise his voice. "You need to know how." Outside, in the gray light of the clearing, Charles showed her everything. How to load, how to breathe, how to hold her elbow tight and let the weapon become an extension of her will. Jessica's hands shook, but she listened. The first shot startled her. The sound cracked through the trees, sharp and final. Noah cried, inside. She flinched. Charles stood steady. Again. She fired again. And again. Her shoulders ached, but her aim grew steady. By the time they went back inside, dusk had fallen, draping the cabin in a soft gray hush. The fire still glowed in the hearth, casting long shadows that swayed gently across the floorboards. Charles took the guns back to the table, setting them down with deliberate care. His movements were practiced, almost ritualistic, breaking them down, checking chambers, wiping the barrels clean of the day's cold and grit. Jessica fed Noah near the fire, her lullabies soft and low, timed with each careful spoonful. Her hands still trembled from the training, from the reality of what might come, but her voice did not. It steadied her more than anything else could. She glanced over at Charles. There was something about the way he worked, so exact, so respectful, that made her pause. He did not treat the guns like tools of violence, not anymore. He handled them like relics, as if they were a burden he had chosen to carry, out of necessity, not desire. Every motion seemed to ask forgiveness for what those weapons had. When Noah finally drifted to sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in peace, Jessica rose, wrapped herself in Charles's old coat, and stepped outside into the fading light. The sky had darkened, thick clouds pressing low over the treetops, and snow had begun to fall again, gentle now, like breath exhaled by the mountains. She walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at the trees. Then, without thinking, she began to sing. A lullaby. Not just for Noah, for herself, for whatever ghosts still wandered this land. The tune was one her mother used to hum when Jessica was a child, before the world had hardened around them all. The words came back easily, worn smooth by time. Sleep, my darling, sleep through the night. Safe from the dark, safe from the fright. The melody curled into the forest, winding between the trunks, brushing past the pine needles. It didn't feel small. It felt like a beacon. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open. She did not turn, but she knew it was him. Charles stepped out, boots crunching softly against the snow. His rifle hung loosely over his shoulder, but his gaze was no longer scanning the woods. He stood still, listening. When the last note faded, Jessica turned. He was watching her, not her lips, not her face. And in his eyes, for the first time, she saw something she had never dared to hope for. Not grief, not shame, but longing, not for her body, not even for her song, for what her song meant. Possibility. He wanted to believe again. She stepped toward him, her voice low and steady. "You're not the man in those stories." His brow creased, uncertain. "You're not the gun," she continued. "You're the hands that made music, the hands that kept my son warm, that carried us out of the snow." He looked down at those hands, scarred, shaking, and still. "I used to think," he said, voice hoarse, "that a man could only be what the world made of him, that if they call you a killer long enough, you start to believe it." She waited, not breathing. "And now?" she whispered. He glanced up, and for once did not flinch. "I think you might be right." Inside the cabin, Noah stirred, and for the first time in years, Charles Mackay did not feel the urge to run. The snow had stopped falling. Morning light crept through the trees in pale gold, casting long, flickering shadows across the forest floor. Everything shimmered under a fine crust of frost, untouched and pristine, as if nature had laid a blanket over the violence of the world. But it was not peaceful. Not today. Charles stood at the window like a statue carved from stone, his breath forming pale clouds against the glass. His shoulders were taut, jaw clenched, hand resting loosely near the pistol at his side. His eyes didn't blink. "They're here," he said. Jessica looked up from the hearth, where she was feeding Noah. Her arms instinctively drew the child tighter to her chest. Her gaze followed his to the trees. 3 riders emerged from the forest, moving slowly, deliberately. The horses snorted clouds into the cold air. The man in front wore a coat that did not belong to the mountains. Dark wool, brass buttons. Dawson. Jessica's stomach dropped. Behind him rode 2 others, dressed rough and armed heavily. Their faces were hidden beneath hats pulled low and scarves drawn tight, but their posture screamed violence. They halted just short of the clearing, 10 paces from the porch, close enough for a bullet to reach them, too far for reason. Dawson dismounted and dusted the snow from his sleeves with theatrical flair. His grin was wide and false. "Jessica," he called out, his voice cutting through the cold like a knife. "You know what I'm here for. I won't ask twice. Bring me my son." Jessica froze, her feet rooted, heart racing. Her grip on Noah tightened, even as the child began to fuss. Charles turned slightly toward her, not taking his eyes from the window. "Do not open that door," he said, calm but firm. "I have to." "You do not," he said again, steel in his voice now. "He's not taking either of you." Jessica swallowed hard, unsure if she was more afraid of Dawson or of losing someone willing to face him. Outside, Dawson laughed. "You think hiding behind a killer makes you untouchable?" he taunted. "You think a blood-stained coward like McCade can stop me? He's just a story people tell to scare cowards." He raised his rifle slowly. Charles was already moving. The front door flew open in a blur of motion. Charles stepped out into the open, the revolver in his hand steady, cold, certain. Dawson's eyes widened in surprise, but he did not flinch. "I'll give you one chance, McCade," he said, snarling. "Step aside." Charles said nothing. Behind him, Jessica crouched low, peeking through the crack in the wall, heart pounding. Then came the gunfire. It was fast, brutal, over in seconds. Charles fired once. One of Dawson's men collapsed, a perfect shot to the chest. The second man lifted his rifle too late. Another shot. Another body hit the snow. Dawson screamed in rage, diving behind a tree. He fired back wildly, bullets splintering the porch post, tearing chunks from the cabin wall. Charles moved again, ducking low, reloading with mechanical grace. He stepped forward into the clearing. Then a shot cracked. Charles jerked back, stumbling. A burst of red stained his coat near the shoulder. Jessica cried out from inside the cabin. But Charles did not fall. He lifted his gun again, aimed steady despite the blood, and fired. The bullet struck the tree an inch from Dawson's skull. The man screamed and scrambled for his horse, eyes wide with panic. "I'll be back," he shouted, voice trembling. "You think this is done? You think—" He never finished. He rode hard into the woods, disappearing into the trees. Silence dropped like a curtain. Charles stood still, breath ragged, blood dripping into the snow. Jessica burst from the cabin. Noah clutched to her chest. "You're shot," she cried. "It's nothing," he muttered. She ran to him anyway, helped him inside, her fingers cold but sure. She peeled off his coat, revealing the graze across his shoulder. It was deep, but clean, a pass-through. "You're lucky," she whispered. He nodded once, jaw clenched. Noah whimpered. Jessica looked at Charles, tears shining in her eyes. "You kept us safe." He met her gaze, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw not the gunslinger, just the man. "Always," he said. Charles spent the next 2 days recovering in silence. Jessica tended to him with quiet diligence. She boiled water each morning, steeped herbs into bitter concoctions for fever, and cleaned his wound twice a day with hands that trembled only slightly now. Her touch was careful but firm, her voice steady even when his skin flinched beneath the cold cloth. She never asked if he was in pain. He never said thank you. But something passed between them in those moments, something deeper than words. Charles watched her closely, though he tried not to make it obvious. His eyes followed her as she moved through the cabin, her footsteps soft, her presence constant. She sang to Noah often, low lullabies that drifted through the rooms like smoke, filling the empty spaces with something warmer than firelight. He listened to those songs, every note, every breath. On the third night, snow began to fall again, not a storm, just a quiet drift of flakes, settling like lace over the cabin windows. The wind whispered through the trees outside, but inside all was still. Jessica sat on the floor with Noah in her lap, the baby swaddled in layers of wool. She gently played with his hands, humming to him between kisses to his soft brow. Charles sat in the chair by the fire, eyes half-lidded, his shoulder still aching with every movement. He was not thinking of guns or Dawson or the cold. He was looking at the piano. Jessica noticed but said nothing. Then he stood. He walked slowly across the room, each step careful. When he reached the instrument, he paused. The cloth that covered it was thick with dust and time. He stared at it for a long moment before reaching out and peeling it back with both hands, revealing the old piano beneath. The wood was scratched, dulled by years of neglect. The keys were yellowed, the ivory cracked in places, but the soul of it remained. Charles sat on the bench. He did not touch the keys right away. His fingers hovered, hesitant, as though afraid they would shatter whatever fragile thing stirred inside him. Then he played. Just 3 notes. Crooked, uneven, slightly out of tune. They rang in the cabin like the echo of a voice long forgotten. Jessica stilled, afraid even her breath might break the moment. He played another note, then another. A slow line emerged, staggered, unsure, a melody not yet whole. But it was music. When he stopped, he did not move for a long time. He sat with his hands resting lightly on the keys, eyes closed, chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Jessica stood and crossed to the table. She found a scrap of paper, clean and blank. The next morning when she returned, it had writing on it, a melody, a title, For the Voice That Stayed. She found it folded beneath her cup. Jessica pressed it to her chest and blinked away tears. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep and the fire burned low, she sat beside Charles at the piano. He spoke, quietly, barely audible. "Your voice was the first thing I touched that did not feel dirty." Jessica turned to him, her heart aching with something she could not name. It was the first time she heard his voice break, not from pain, but from something deeper. Forgiveness. The first thaw of spring came late that year, slow and quiet. Snow melted in sheets down the mountain slopes, revealing earth that had not seen sunlight in months. When Charles stepped out of the cabin with Jessica and Noah beside him, they were not fugitives. They were survivors. Together, they rode into the nearest town, not to hide, but to speak. Jessica's testimony was strong, unwavering. With Charles's support, she brought to light every buried truth about the mining camp. The stolen gold, the murdered workers, the nameless graves hidden by pine roots and snow. The courtroom was packed. A territory judge presided, his expression grim as the horrors were laid bare. Dawson stood in shackles. His sentence was swift. Death by hanging. Justice, long frozen, began to thaw. But the courtroom held one more reckoning. Charles stood. He gave no excuses. No defense. He listed names, places, towns where he had drawn his weapon for coin. When he finished, he turned to the judge and said, "If truth and silence can buy back even a breath of what I stole, then I will not run from your sentence." Jessica's voice broke the quiet. She spoke not of the man he was, but of the man she met, the man who saved her life, protected her son, and never once sought praise. The judge leaned forward. "You will not be jailed," he said, "but you will stay. This territory needs men who understand how shadows move. You will assist our marshals." Quietly. Charles nodded. And so he stayed. Years passed. He became a guardian of the mining frontier, watchful, just, and feared by those who once ruled by fear. Jessica opened a music school for orphaned children, many of whom had lost parents to the very crimes she had once fled. Her voice became a balm for the wounded. In the center of the school stood a piano, old, worn, once silent. Now it sang again. Charles played it sometimes. Not for himself, for the children, or peace. Noah grew tall and curious, calling Charles Pa when no one else was listening. And Jessica, she never needed a title. She had him. One evening, as snow dusted the windows once more, Jessica sat beside Charles after supper. The fire was low, the room warm. She looked at him and asked softly, "Do you think you've redeemed yourself?" Charles placed his hand over hers. He said nothing, but in his eyes lived a truth deeper than words. Guilt does not vanish, but if carried with grace, it can become the foundation of something worthy. A life re-earned, day by day, note by note, choice by quiet, steadfast choice. If this story stirred something deep within you, if you felt the chill of the blizzard, the tremble in a lullaby, or the silent strength of a man rebuilding his soul, then you understand what Wild West love stories is all about. Out here, love does not ride in on gallant horses. It comes through quiet acts, hard choices, and hearts that keep beating long after the gunfire fades. It is messy, it is redemptive, and it is real. If you want more tales of courage, heartbreak, and devotion on the lawless frontier, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a story. This is Wild West Love Stories, where bullets miss but hearts do not. We'll see you on the next ride.